Thank you, Terry, for joining this DRR Pioneer interview. It's great to have you on board. We would like to know, first of all, how did you initially get engaged in DRR work in your early days?
Yeah, I'd say rather that I got involved in disaster research than specifically DRR, disaster risk reduction. And I think it's important to say that I'm not really a disaster specialist. I'm a development studies person who realized that it was important to look at disasters and more recently at climate change. So the issue for me has been actually, and this happened around the work that we did to create the book At Risk, was why disasters commanded so much attention. So we'll come on to that in a minute, but of the 4 authors of the book, 3 of us were geographers who mostly worked in relation to what's called development studies, what in those days was known as the Third World. And to some extent, we were quite surprised that disasters commanded so much attention, because the likelihood that you might be harmed, killed or harmed in an extreme event was extremely low, and you were much more likely to be harmed, sick, ill, or die prematurely from a whole myriad of other problems that were affecting poor people in hundreds of millions in the so-called Third World. So hunger, malnutrition, poverty, disease, lack of health care, all of those problems were far and away more significant than extreme events, and they still are. And to that, we could add other risks, such as in India and China, the estimates, and of course they can't be completely accurate, but in both of those countries, the estimates are that around 200,000 people a year die on the roads. Okay, now you would need the entire 20th century to get anywhere near that number of deaths from extreme natural hazards. And we actually, in that risk, we had in the early pages a comparison of the risks of death between different factors, and extreme sudden onset extreme events were a tiny percentage of the cause of deaths in developing countries. And so one of the things that we looked at, that I was interested in, how was it that extreme events commanded so much interest? And that doesn't mean to say that they are not important to try to reduce, but it's about what is going on in terms of construction of scientific understanding that they command that level of interest. And so I was coming to disasters from a development studies background, and until relatively recently, actually the last probably 20 years, when I added climate change into my work on extreme events, I have always been a development studies person and not a disaster specialist. So that's a large part of the background.
Okay, and was this your major insight in those early days, that somehow disasters as extreme events were not a major cause of mortality, but to some extent there were quite a lot of people affected by disasters? I mean, nowadays it's about 200 million, they say, and there's also a major impact on people's livelihoods. So we should also not underestimate the impact of disasters, especially if combined with the factors that you mentioned, and because in many places people are also infected by conflict, or they're affected by disease and so on. So how did you kind of find the balance between saying do not overestimate disasters, but at the same time they do have, especially in certain places, a major impact on people's development and their long-term ability to have a proper livelihood? So was that something you faced or you addressed?
I think in a sense you've just kind of summed it up, that the idea was that you had to look at it all together. You couldn't separate the disasters out from all the other problems of livelihoods and everyday life. And so one of the things we thought about then was that disasters were a symptom of failed development. So in particular, you could also apply that in so-called rich countries to poor people in so-called rich countries. So New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, Louisiana, you could see that as the failure in the United States to provide proper lives for poor white and black people. And so I think this is not only about the so-called third world, as it was then, the developing countries. This is about how your likelihood of being harmed by a whole range of events is socially constructed. And I think this was the perspective that we developed then in the book At Risk, that in a sense, the four authors independently, not only us, but others as well before, had wanted to focus on how people's risk of being harmed in their lives was socially constructed. So the fact that you were poor and vulnerable was not to do with you being somehow a strange person who happened to be poor, but your poverty and vulnerability was caused by the way in which society operated to make some people much more likely to be harmed than others when an event came along. And so a lot of my other early work was, and this is where the overlap is with development, was on food systems, hunger, and famines. So it wasn't on extreme events in that sense. It was on how do we understand food systems to see what it is that makes some people hungry and others have plenty to eat. And so this was the kind of overlap with that. And in fact, the first paper I wrote that has anything to do with disasters was in 1976. And I was actually at the time in India. I was young, naive, and I was going to my first visit to a third world country. I was incredibly naive, and I was trying to understand. And my focus was actually on rural livelihoods and on migration and credit systems that farmers might have access to. But while I was there was severe flooding. And so I felt, well, I had to try to understand what's going on in relation to the floods. And I began to understand how the likelihood that you would be harmed in floods in India was socially determined by the system of caste and class, which allocated risks unequally between different groups of people. And I had not researched disasters. I had a basic understanding of the physical hazard processes because I'd been trained in geography. My first discipline was geography. And so I was then trying to understand, well, what is going on here where this focuses on the extreme events, but the people around me are experiencing hunger, ill health. And so I gave presented that paper to the Indian Geographical Society in Calcutta, and got quite a lot of good feedback on it. But this was my first attempt to try to integrate my understanding of development problems with disaster risk. And half of that paper is not on floods, it's on hunger and the work that was going on, especially in the Sahel, on the social construction of famine. A lot of it was in French, and there was because of the Sahel countries mostly being Francophone. And so the early work was actually, you could say that the early work was on social construction of risk and not on disasters. And this was applied to famine, hunger, food systems, natural hazards, and later on to climate change. So that's basically how I kind of tried to see this whole thing as being part of a whole, rather than I think the problem with disaster risk reduction still today is hugely that it's seen as a specific zone, a specific area to be worked on in isolation from everything else.
I think the interesting thing in at risk is also that you do not just say there's vulnerability on the one hand and there's hazards on the other side. There's also the different layers, and there's the underlying causes, and then there's the root causes. I think that really links back to development, and I think this was a major breakthrough. But how did you the four of you meet around this at-risk publication, because that's interesting for the history, because you're quite, the four of you are quite well-known and strong characters, and to sit together and agree upon a joint publication must have been an interesting process.
Yeah, well, it started off actually with, and of course there is always a challenge with four strong people sitting down, but I would think that 80% of it was relatively good in terms of getting things done. They took a long time. The first book took 7 years to complete. Wow. From when we first met to it being published. And that was partly because there were four of us, and this was pre-email. You know, everything had to be sent by post, by snail mail. And if we were lucky, we'd have a telephone call at a time when a call to the United States for 10 minutes would cost you £20. Mm-hmm. So this was a time when communications were awkward. And we were four people in 3 different countries. So that made it extremely difficult to actually get together for meetings to discuss. It came together, actually, that first paper that I did in 1976 was led to me being invited to a conference in St. Andrews University. Actually, it was a student-led conference, and they were doing some really interesting things in radical geography. There was a very strong movement of radical geography at that time. And the students organized something which was sort of outside of the mainstream of what the geography department was doing. And geography in those days was a pretty conservative discipline in terms of this kind of understanding of social factors, political factors that might determine how people live. And in fact, at one stage, I left geography because I was so disenchanted with it as a discipline which would enable me to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I left it for a year to go into a department of political theory. So what happened at that conference in St. Andrews is that I met Ben Wisner. He was also one of the participants and speakers. And we clicked in terms of understanding that there was something going on here about understanding disasters where they were completely seen in isolation from the other problems of third world peoples. And so we started thinking about how we might put together a book on this. And initially what we were aware of is a lot of these critiques of disaster studies were in the so-called grey literature. They weren't getting mainstream attention and they weren't getting research funding. And so initially the idea was to produce an edited collection which would be bringing all of these together. And one of those papers was by Piers Blakey, and that was on what in those days was seen as a very strange title, and he then made it into a book, was The Political Economy of Soil Erosion. Now, if you're a physical geographer and you're looking at issues of what causes a landslide, that is quite a challenge, because basically this was suggesting that if you wanted to understand landslides and soil erosion, you had to look at the social factors, political and economic factors that might be linked to its causation. One of the best known of that is road construction in mountainous areas as the cause of it. And so this was an interesting link, because the road developments in Nepal, for example, were supposed to be providing development, but in fact were causing great suffering because of the landslides that were associated with their badly designed construction. So, so we had this idea for an edited collection, and some really quite interesting materials were coming out, but they were very isolated. Some of them were not published properly. And from that, I think it was Ben had the idea, well, instead of bringing all this together, why don't we write a book? And why don't we bring in Piers Blakey, making him a co-author on this, because he had developed this thinking around risk in relation to landslides and political economy. And then we became aware of Ian Davis's work on disasters, both on disaster preparedness, but a lot of it on relief and reconstruction, where he was providing extremely interesting critical approaches to that. And so what happened is that in 1986, we actually got together at the annual conference of the Institute of British Geographers. So the creation myth is we sat down for the first time together in Reading University at this conference and planned out the idea of a co-written volume. So this was quite interesting and challenging as well, that we would co-write the volume. And we had meetings, workshops. Fortunately, we were then in only two countries, so we did have a bit more chance to get together. And then we split up into 3 countries and put together the first edition of At Risk, which came out in 1994. And the 2 main goals of that were, firstly, that disasters must not be seen separately from the other problems of development or inadequate failed development, that they had to be understood in relation to people's livelihoods. They were only one factor and a relatively minor factor in terms of the big risks that people faced. And as you hinted earlier, deaths, mortality is not a very good measure of the disruption caused by these extreme events. It is much more the disruption of livelihoods, damage to assets, so on. And the second factor, the second goal, was to make the argument that disasters are not natural, because the predominant approach at that time, although there was work going on against it, Ken Hewitt and O'Keeffe's work earlier on, there's still the dominant approach to disasters, but they were caused by nature. And a lot of the researchers in actual individual hazards perceived them as natural hazards and did not understand the social construction of the disaster that came along. So this idea of root causes that were in politics, economics, and social factors was not well understood. So as you hinted at, the pressure and release model, the so-called crunch model, has got the hazards on one side, but this hazard does not cause a disaster unless you've also got the vulnerability on the other side. You cause a disaster because they crunch together, but if people on this side are not vulnerable, the hazard cannot create a disaster. You have to have the 2 together. And so the second main goal of the book was to argue for the fact that disasters are not natural. That argument is still going on today. Some people are now reverting to the idea that disasters are natural, and a number of governments love calling them natural because that gets them off the hook. Because if a disaster is socially created by political and economic processes, then the government does not want to be identified as a partial cause of the reason that people are vulnerable. And so there are still some groups of people that still love to call disasters natural.
Do you think that people really learn from insights from the past? I mean, you're clearly stating that development cannot be disconnected from the whole disaster vulnerability, and that a naturalness of disaster is a misnomer. But you feel like nowadays, I mean, 30 years later, people do not seem to even be aware of these insights, or at least some of the new researchers, and they just want to find out things themselves and start from scratch. There doesn't seem to be a linear development in the understanding of disasters and vulnerability. How do you think this comes about? You even mentioned it when you're dealing with your students, that it's very challenging for them to even understand it, let's say accept it. Yes. So can you explain how that comes about?
Well, I think the problem is that people are in disciplines and they get trained in particular disciplines. So those who are in the physical sciences, who are trained around a particular kind of hazard, earthquake, tsunami, volcanoes, flood risk, and so on, they have a particular approach. And of course, these are extremely complicated hazard events to be able to understand from a scientific perspective. So we do need that knowledge, that understanding. But I think that while those who work on disaster research, looking at disasters, have to understand a fair degree of what the physical cause is, the actual natural hazard, I have to have a basic understanding of the science of floods and of earthquakes in order to see how the hazard side might have an effect on the vulnerability side. But by and large, my experience over the decades has been that on the other side, the people who are studying the natural hazards do not feel that it is necessary to understand social causation. They don't need to understand the vulnerability side of the equation. And I think that that is possibly getting a bit better, but by and large, I still see that they're pretty isolated. And I think this is partly the way in which universities are structured and organized. I mean, many years ago in those radical geography groups that I was involved in, we did a paper on why does geography claims to be the discipline that unifies the physical and the human worlds, okay? And yet you can still specialize in an undergraduate degree in either physical geography or human geography. And those people who teach those two sides of it are very often in different buildings. At Sussex, the physical geographers are in a different building from the human geographers. And this is actually not, and that's been reproduced for decades. The book At Risk, which you could argue is actually exactly about how do you integrate the understanding of the physical geography with the human geography. The first edition was reviewed in only one geography journal, although many geographers would say, well, our discipline is about how you unify the physical world with the human world. Only one journal thought that it was worth reviewing the book, which we found quite extraordinary at the time. So I think the way in which disciplines emerge, how they recreate themselves, reproduce themselves, it goes along with that. And I think that you hinted at me having talked about my students. I teach students in disaster risk reduction and climate change in 5 or 6 different universities in Europe and in Bangladesh. And in all of those, every year, there is a necessity to basically come to an explanation as to why disasters are not natural. It's extremely difficult for some of them to grasp that, because a disaster is seen as something which is triggered by a natural event, and the actual understanding of social causation is something which is new. Now, I think many of these students have done environment degrees or even geography degrees or some kind of social science degree, many of them. And I think the problem here is that in our day, by our day, I mean the authors of the book At Risk, we all came through a system in which class and class analysis was absolutely fine. Not perhaps favored by everyone, because of course it was associated with Marxism, and some would say if you like to understand class analysis, that means you're a communist or you're a communist sympathizer. But at least at that time in social sciences in North America and Europe, around the politics of decolonization, of national liberation struggles, the Vietnam War, and so on, it was relatively respectable to understand class. So when I went to India, the primary thing that I wanted to understand was who owns land and who does not own land. Who is the landlord running this village? And I met some of them. Mm-hmm. And now my work in India and Bangladesh, none of the NGOs, none of the students have an understanding of class. And my students in Britain or in Europe do not understand class. And this is regarded as being an unnecessary social category. And as a result of that, the understanding that something like root causes exist, which are related to the way in which society structures wealth, inequality, ownership or non-ownership of assets like land, all of that is becoming missed. All of that is excluded from the actual way in which students are understanding the world. And I think so we've got a number of factors, a number of reasons why this struggle to on the social causation is still going on.
Has the introduction of the whole concept of resilience somehow contributed to that, or does it also have added value? Because I mean, there's like two views on the I mean, some say it's a more neoliberal concept, others say it does build on people's capacity, but it kind of now dominates a lot of DRR work, and somehow the more kind of class social vulnerability thinking has been overshadowed by the resilience thinking. So how do you see that as a new development? And it's not new. I mean, it's already there for 15 years, but it's still quite dominant, I think. No?
Yeah. Well, this is one of those difficult categories or concepts. Who could possibly be against resilience? I mean, you know, it sounds like a wonderful idea. How, if I said, oh, I don't like resilience, it sounds like I'm being inhumane. But what I don't like is the concept of resilience and how it's used. And you've already hinted, I think this is a word which is used by institutions and organizations for their convenience. And some institutions and organizations have used it in a neoliberal way. So in particular in North America and to some extent in Britain, it is used around the idea that people have to take responsibility for their own lives, for example, in flood preparedness. And in that sense, it supports the retreat of the state coming back from its responsibilities. But the other one, the more positive one, I've heard people in organizations say, well, resilience is the term that enables us to integrate disaster risk with climate change adaptation and development. So what could possibly be wrong with that? Well, the problem I have with it is that the word obscures the causation of those problems. So resilience is something you build, you construct resilience for these people, but the terminology does not allow for the analysis of why do people need resilience in the first place? What is going on in society in relation to politics and economics that makes them vulnerable, that makes them have no good, decent health service? And to my mind, the word resilience is very convenient for organizations because they can say, we're spending money to build resilience. And it removes the need to explain, well, why do people need resilience? What are you going to do differently to the causes of why people need to have resilience built for them? So I regard it as a very slippery, difficult concept. And I think these concepts, these words, I call them fake concepts. And a lot of my recent work with a very good team of others has been on the very slippery word community or community-based. Now, that does not make me very well favored in disaster risk reduction because most disaster risk work is around community-based and a lot of climate adaptation work is around community-based adaptation. But this word or resilience or empowerment, sustainability, all of these words have been taken up within the structures of power for the benefit of the organizations that want to use them. And I think we have to unpack them, analyze why they're being used and what is the value of them for different actors. Why is this word resilience useful for funders, donors, and governments?
Okay, and then another major development is the merger between climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. I mean, do you see also that by stressing the whole climate aspect, there's also a risk that the social dimension is being overlooked, or do you see a possibility of bringing that perspective from the early days still into the climate thinking as well?
Yeah, I think it's basically a good idea that they should be integrated and that they should both be integrated more with development. They should all be subsumed into what we might call the idea of improving human well-being in all of these areas and not carving them off into these separate areas. But I think what you're hinting at, I do agree with, which is that climate change and the need to adapt to climate change is in danger of obscuring what is causing people's vulnerability and the likelihood that they might suffer. My recent work, especially in Bangladesh, has, to my mind, satisfied me that there is a problem with the way in which climate change and adaptation is actually discussed, because the causation is not coming out of it. And in particular, the problems of how you get ready for, prepare for, adapt to climate change is now obscuring what is causing people's vulnerability in the first place. Because none of the problems in most countries in the world are directly caused by global warming. People's poverty, their hunger, the lack of health care, all of those problems pre-exist climate change. So the issue is, if climate change is regarded as a magnifier or an intensifier of these problems, why on earth will those original problems and their causes go away just because now we frame them around climate change? So I think that there is this danger that climate change adaptation in particular becomes a way of obscuring what are the causes of the problem as to why people need adaptation. So the vast majority of people in Bangladesh who are identified as being in the front line of facing climate change and dealing with climate change risks now, none of their existing problems are related to global warming. They're related to systems of power which allocate land unequally between different classes. We're coming back to class analysis, why there are owners of large areas of land, many people who have very little land or no land, and what you can do. Here's a very practical problem. In much of Bangladesh, 70% of the people in the countryside have no land or tiny plots of land. To adapt to climate change, what do? The primary understanding of adaptation is that you do your farming differently. Somehow or other, you change your farming so it can cope with the problems coming from climate change. 70% of the people have hardly any land or no land at all. What is their adaptation model? Okay, and so primarily what we have to understand is, why are they poor and landless in the first place? Why do they suffer hunger, low wages, ill health in the first place? Before we can address what might happen with disaster risk reduction or adaptation to climate change, we need to understand, again, the social causation of why people are in these different categories of likelihood of harm.
Okay, thanks so much for the interview. It's been very interesting to hear your view. I think a lot of these insights are still very valuable today, and I hope those who will watch the video in the future will be inspired by it. And thanks again, Terry.
Thanks, Bruno.